Hi everyone, my name is Monserrat Saucedo, and I am presenting my project, which I called Transforming with Translanguaging, because it's all about translanguaging. Um, and I will explore and explain a little bit of why I chose this in my next slide. For my rationale, basically, as a bilingual student, growing up speaking Spanish at home, language was just always something that piqued my interest. And I was always speaking English and Spanish, mainly Spanish at home. But again, it was kind of that back and forth, simultaneously speaking both languages. And I felt like beyond code switching, I was just interested in how, translanguaging can be a support, can be a guide for students. Um, and I'm just really in love with my culture, the language, and the overall impact language can have on other people as well that don't speak Spanish and actually learn Spanish academically, which a lot of my students at my school speak English as their L1 and are learning Spanish because, for context, I am at MacArthur, which is a dual language school. Um, and I decided to focus on a group of bilingual students who I felt like heavily rely on translanguaging because what was unique about this group was the fact that some of the students not only spoke English and Spanish, some of them spoke three languages total. So I had one student, Josh, my student Josh, he actually speaks Mongolian at home. So again, it was that interest of knowing how he's able to build understanding through the material um, and really use translanguaging to his benefit, to his advantage. That back and forth and how it looks like for him versus other students. And overall, again, really focusing on language and going beyond code switching. I just really wanted to focus and hone in on what's happening, what's the process, what does it look like, and my research questions. So for my teacher-focused research question, how can I, as a teacher researcher, provide translanguaging supports to develop reading skills for sixth grade EB students during literacy? And for student focused, I did how do sixth grade EB students use translanguaging supports to develop reading skills during literacy? So let's explore that a little bit further. So this is just my framework. I won't go too into detail about it, but overall, just I wanted to help acknowledge student identity linguistically, academically, help them see their potential and help them succeed. And often I do have to remind them to try attempting to respond back to me in Spanish. So, en español, por favor, is something that I'm always saying to them. And, just helping them build their students, their academic repertoire and vocab and comprehension. And overall, just as these references mention, translanguaging goes beyond the alternation of languages. It captures instead the full and complex repertoires of practices that individuals have. And let's explore that even more. So, my data and collection tools. I have my data listed, my tools listed. The only one that really changed were my codes, which I kind of adapted as they did their book projects. I just felt like I had to change them to make it make more sense for the book projects. And I noticed that I actually myself was translanguaging, and that's something that I added, teacher translanguaging, also student translanguaging, language support, how was I supporting them through translanguaging? Because that's the overall question. But yeah, just very quickly, these are, my data points that I have also uploaded in my OneDrive and just my tools, which, they're listed right here, but we will move on. So again, the purpose was to seek further understanding of how students utilize translanguaging during our sixth grade bilingual literacy block. And again, just overall, like 90% of the day, the students are speaking in Spanish. Just the way that the day is kind of marked out, they are mainly speaking in Spanish. So let's move on. How were students being guided? So for my lesson one, I began to explain, the book project, what they had to do, what they had to investigate. Overall, it had to be an informational like narrative story, so it could be anything that they wanted. It did have to be related to like Earth or the planets, but it was really up to them to choose like what they wanted to pick. So, I explained it, showed them a video, um, and then I let them investigate their own topics. So a lot of them, started asking me questions. That's why you'll see a lot of student response tallied on here, for example, for lesson one. But then also, I showed examples. So I ended up showing them, different examples of how they could incorporate images, how they could incorporate facts. So a lot of that modeling piece and that support piece, again, tying back to my questions, how could I support them through translanguaging? And some of my examples were in Spanish, some of them were in English. And again, that kind of helped those students that were strong in Spanish and not strong in English, but then also the students that were stronger in English and not strong in Spanish. So it was kind of like that back and forth. And I just translated as I went if I had any, English examples. And then lesson two was when I worked with one of my guided reading groups and we read The Very Hungry Caterpillar together. And this was just to help them understand what a solid example looked like physically. What did it look like? What kind of characters were in the story? How were the facts laid out? Because it really is a book that might seem like it doesn't teach much, but in the end, we talked about how The Very Hungry Caterpillar had fictional and non-fictional parts to it. And students, whoever reads it, little kids, younger kids, older kids, they learn something from it. So that was the overall purpose. And again, I felt like that was a very important support piece to not only have a physical copy, but to have that language support and that conversation started and, allowing them to respond to me mainly in Spanish, the effort to respond to me in Spanish to help them kind of grasp and get an idea of what they wanted to do for their books. So for lesson one, you can kind of see how I labeled what was happening. So I labeled the translanguaging that I was doing in blue and the student translanguaging in purple. And it makes sense why in lesson one there is more teacher translanguaging because again, I was providing that support, those examples, the modeling, the guides. Um, and then during guided reading groups, they were the ones responding to me through translanguaging and building an understanding of what was expected for their books. And again, really helping them understand as well, like different parts of a story, what's fictional, what's non-fictional. And I just felt like that was vital within itself to help them create their own stories. So, finding number one, teacher translanguaging provides support. So, I felt like, again, I wanted to have very solid examples. And what I love about this page is for my finding, you can see that the very first image where the girl is kind of floating, that's actually a book from Epic, and it's an example that I modeled and showed them. So you can kind of see it's in English, right? So I just kind of translate it along the way. But the main reason I wanted to show it was because it has like the little Saturn picture, and in that Saturn drawing bubble, it has like a fact. And if you look right below it, one of my students decided to write about Saturn or the planets, and now he chose to have the planet and have the planet have a speech bubble with a fact. So you can kind of see that parallel of how this student took this example and made it his own, but also used translanguaging, that conversation we had and the conversation within the classroom of what was expected. He was able to make it his own and put it within his story. So translanguaging was a way that it allowed him to grasp what was needed and just fully create something that was unique through that support. So finding number two, students recognize connections within languages. So again, what I love about this finding as well because you can see the parallel between the very hungry caterpillar on top and the student example on bottom. Um, what is really awesome, if you speak Spanish, you notice the parallels between the languages because even in the very first sentence, the words aren't spelled, perfect in Spanish, but it's because this student is writing it as if it was in English. So he's being influenced by English in attempts to write it in Spanish. So even the way he spelled efecto, that's how you would spell it in English, but without the O, obviously, effect. So you can kind of see even just the parallel of the format of the Very Hungry Caterpillar and my student's example, you can kind of see that they're recognizing that connection and um, even beyond like what we talked about in class. I can tell that this student did not rely on Google Translate. He actually attempted to type this on his own. And again, really showed how his repertoire is growing and that attempt and that connection is really there because he has a very solid example. It's not perfect. I don't think anyone had a super perfect example, which was not what I was looking for. It was more just seeing how they're influenced by language and how they can create their own books through that influence. So for my conclusion, just very quickly, it was just very clear throughout the whole thing that not only can students handle the material, but they do utilize translanguaging to build an understanding when it comes to literacy. So, we had moments where they were able to share their own ideas and they were sharing them in Spanish and, amongst themselves, would clarify what they had to do. And that was really awesome that they were supporting each other within translanguaging. Um, and the entire process, it relied on translanguaging because they had to find those facts that were in Spanish, incorporate that within their storyline, which was in Spanish, um, have a rough draft of their story in Spanish. And again, I felt like through translanguaging, they were able to really transfer those ideas through into their story. And I felt like also it allowed them to create those very powerful stories and it was just the foundation of their understanding. Translanguaging, it's important to acknowledge that it exists because as you can tell, it yielded amazing results. The way that they had their stories laid out, and in my OneDrive, I have screen recordings of some examples. You can just tell right away that it's something that we need to allow to foster within the classroom, and allow students to practice because it really just built a strong community within the classroom, but then also academically built these really strong stories. So again, big fan of translanguaging, and I would say that I was just overall a really big fan of seeing how it works within the classroom and taking notes, taking journals, taking pictures, audio, everything. It really all just ended up connecting together and I'm just really amazed by the results and that's really all I have. I hope you guys enjoyed.